Hi everyone and welcome to our 4 p.m. session. We are live at our EFT for Bats and Beyond. Behind us you can see our historical bat houses located here on Museum Road on the West End. We would like to take a chance and introduce our graduate students that are awesome behind the scenes to make this work. We have Kat, we have Teresa, we have Morgan, we have Kevin, we also have Wafia in the background. Also, I am Karyn Moses, a third-year PhD student in the Agriculture and Biological Engineering Department. We would like to take a moment to introduce all of our scientists, which are the brains behind this EFT. First, we have Dr. Reed here, we have Dr. Mathis, and we have our faithful and loyal research student, Lauren Hammer. First of all, we would like each one of you to take a moment and introduce yourselves and answer the question of why you chose to study bats.
Great. So I'm David Reed. I'm a curator of mammals here at the University of Florida. And my day job is to take care of a large collection of mammal specimens, and Verity will tell you a little bit more about that. But I started studying bats just because I had a graduate student who wanted to come work with me, and he was already interested in bats and knew a lot about them. And he said, David, can you teach me the genetics and I'll teach you something about bats? And it worked out really well. He taught me all about bats. We still do bat research together now, and I taught him how to do the genetics that we use to study the bats.
Hi, I'm Verity Mathis, and I help manage the collections of mammals at the Florida Museum of Natural History. And my research background was actually more with other small mammals, with rodents. And I didn't really do too much with bats until I came here to Florida to work in Dr. Reed's lab and work in the collections. And ever since then, I've been learning more and more about bats and doing research projects with bats. And I wouldn't have it any other way. So.
I'm Lauren Hammer. I'm a third-year biology PhD student in the Florida Museum of Natural History. I work in David Reed's lab. I started studying bats because when looking for programs to work on my dissertation, I knew I really wanted to work outside, work with mammals, and do a ton of really interesting field work, and I fell into this project, and it's been really fascinating.
Thank you all for those introductions and all the work that you do. Before we get started, Dr. Reed, I would like our listeners to actually take an active listen to the bat houses that we have behind us. You can actually hear the small screeches and squeals behind us of all the bats that are located in the bat houses. And actually, while we are standing out here, you can actually smell the bats while they are in the bat houses. It's a pretty peculiar smell. Dr. Reed, first question we would like to ask is, how did you get into bats, and what do you find most interesting about them?
Well, as I said, I had a graduate student who wanted to study them. I'm trained as a mammologist, someone who studies mammals, and so I learned a lot about all the different kinds of mammals, whether they were whales or rodents or bats or whatever. But I hadn't done any research on them until this graduate student, who was from Puerto Rico, came and had already been working on bats. And he said, I'll take you to all the Caribbean islands. We'll study the bats there together. You teach me how to do the genetics in your lab, and it sounded like a great partnership. I think the thing that's most fascinating about them to me as a scientist is they're typical mammals, just like a rodent would be, except they have to fly, of course. They have powered flight just like birds do. And so that means that they have to lower their weight. They have to have incredibly strong upper bodies in order to fly and flap their wings the way that they do. And so it just makes their body and the way that they function a lot different than other mammals. And so that's really interesting and totally different than all of the other kinds of mammals.
Interesting. So, in doing this study, we found that there were a lot of myths about bats. They could be terrorizing, they can have rabies, they can attack people. Can you kind of debunk some of those myths for us?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of people are scared of bats, and I don't really understand all the reasons why. But they're not going to fly into your hair. A lot of people are terrified of that. These bats can fly around tiny little objects. They use this radar echolocation, and they use that better than we can see. It's unbelievable. And if you think about a bat chasing a little moth around that it's trying to catch and eat, it's not going to hit us when it's flying around at night, and it's certainly not going to get tangled in our hair. But people are also worried about the diseases they carry, and that's really a legitimate risk. There are bats that can carry diseases like rabies. So if you see a bat lying on the sidewalk or something, you shouldn't go over and pick it up with a bare hand. If it were to bite you, you could contract rabies. In fact, all of my students and I have the pre-exposure rabies shots just so that we do that as a precaution. Never had any trouble at all, and we rarely ever get bitten, but it's because we're careful. So yeah, all these crazy myths about them, vampire bats being one of them. There's 3 species of bats that do actually feed on blood, but it's not humans that they're biting. So lots of crazy myths about them. I think anything that's of the night and unknown to people, it's easy for myths to grow up around those species. But they're not anything to be scared of.
Well, now that we know there's nothing to be scared of, can you kind of portray to us what are some of the agricultural and environmental benefits to having bats in our environment?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that bats do, especially here in Florida, is they eat lots and lots of insects. And so it's a natural way for crops and everything else to have pest control. So we have the bat houses behind us. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of bats that live there, and every evening they emerge and they fan out across the entire county and probably a bigger distance than that. So they're eating lots and lots of insects. Well, that's free pest control for any person who has crops around. And then in other places, a lot of the bats are also pollinators, and so they're pollinating crop plants and other things, and so that's helpful as well. So there's lots of ways that they're positive for the environment, and they're definitely good to have around.
Okay, so we know how they can affect us, environmentally and agriculturally. So are there any benefit to having bats as far as in our environment, and can we keep them as pets, at our homes locally?
Well, you can't exactly keep them as pets. The primary reason is they eat so much. They have a really high metabolism, and so they're constantly eating. It'd be really hard to keep them alive as pets. But what you can do is you can put up a bat house at your house, and you would have the same benefits of them coming out at night and eating tons and tons of insects around your house. So if you want to lower the number of mosquitoes around your house, you could have a bat house, and that's a great way to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any specific species of bat that is your favorite, Dr. Reed?
Oh yeah, there's lots of favorites. I think one of the coolest ones is a fishing bat. So this bat, we don't have them here, but they're in the Caribbean islands, and it flies low over the water, and it can echolocate and use its little radar to sense fish on top of the water, and then it has these really big hind feet, and it swings them down in the water and catches the fish on the fly, scoops them up, and eats them right out of its feet. Isn't that crazy?
That's really unique.
Is. So Google them. They're called fishing bats. The other name for them is noctilio because it's a night bat. But anyway, they're really cool.
Well, another unique aspect that I want to get back to is the bat houses. And once again, you can hear the screeching out of the bat houses as you listen while we're talking. Can you give us some type of perspective of what makes these bat houses unique, and why do we have these on campus?
Sure. So they are unique. These are the largest bat houses that we know of anywhere in the world. Well, what happened was we had a building on campus that had bats living in the attic, and unfortunately that building burned to the ground, and so those bats were displaced. That was in 1991. And as soon as the bats were displaced from that building, they took up residence in the bleachers of 2 different sports complexes, our track and field and our tennis complex, and that wasn't good for anybody. Too many spectators and too many bats too close together. So the Athletic Association gave some money to the university and said, why don't you try building a bat house, a really big bat house? So they got plans together and they built the first bat house behind us, and that was built in 1991, and it took 4 years for the bats to find it and come over here. So if you build your own bat house, you just have to be patient because it takes a while for them to find them, to get comfortable with them, and then to take up residence. But the first bat house got really full, and after a bunch of years with hundreds of thousands of bats in it, it had a collapse. A big section of it inside collapsed, and they knew they needed to build a second one. So we built the second bat house, and again it took another year or so before they moved over to the second one. And then more recently, last year, we realized the first one's getting pretty old, and so we built a third one, and none of the bats are in there yet. So it's almost been a year, and if you look up in it, there's no bats in it whatsoever, even though the other 2 right next to it are full, which is kind of crazy. But it just takes them time to get comfortable with it and to move over.
All right. Do you have any suggestions for anyone who would like to use the benefits of having a bat? Do you have any suggestions that you can offer people at home?
Sure. There's lots of places where you can either order plans online for a bat house of your own, or you could buy them at craft fairs, and some hardware stores even sell them. But if you get one that's going to last a long time in your environment, because it does take a while for the bats to find it. So don't get discouraged. Have a lot of patience. Put it up high in an area that's both wooded but also has an open area, so that they have a big area where they can fly out over an open space. And the higher up seems to be the best place for them. They like being up off the ground. They feel like that's safer from predators, I think.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Reed.
Sure.
Now we're going to step over and have some questions for this particular segment.
All right, for the scientists, we have a question here from Mabane Middle School after school program. And the question is, as a scientist, what is your favorite thing to do?
Ooh, we should
your
each
job?
answer this because it'll probably be different. Although there's part of it that'll probably be the same too. So my least favorite part is sitting behind a desk. My favorite part is getting out into nature. And so anytime we have the opportunity to get outside and study these animals up close, that's definitely my favorite part.
Yeah, I have to agree with Dr. Reed. That is definitely the best part, is getting out of the office, getting into the caves, getting out in the field, seeing the animals up close and personal. You can't beat that. And sitting behind the desk is definitely the worst part of the job.
I think we're all going to have the same exact answer. Yeah, so I completely agree. The least favorite part is going to be when you're stuck inside all day. By far, the best activity is going to be getting out in the field, getting dirty, running around, holding really cool animals that you wouldn't have a chance to see up close in your day-to-day life.
Okay, and we have another question from Mabane Middle School as well. Are there certain places for a bat to live?
Yeah. You want to do that, or do you want me to?
Go for it.
Go ahead. So bats live in a number of different places. The bats that we study happen to live in caves, and caves are really plentiful in the Bahamas, and you'll hear more about our research in the Bahamas soon. So most of the ones that we deal with live in caves. A lot of them live in abandoned houses or other structures like a bat house. Some of them live under bridges, and then some of them are specialists that live in very specific places. So I'm thinking of, there are some that take banana leaves in tropical places, and they snip the banana leaves in such a way that it folds over and makes a little tent for themselves. And the bats do this every night. Every night they make a new little tent, and they roost right up under that. So sometimes they're specialized, sometimes it's just a cavity in a tree, sometimes it's a cave if it's a cave specialist, but they really can roost in lots of different places.
We have a question that is a combination. There's one question from Mabane Middle School. There's a question by Hannah Price. They're both asking, of all the bats, which ones are the most common, and are they dangerous or friendly? Sure. So here in Florida and generally in the United States, probably one of the most common bats you'll find are the Mexican free-tail bats. And they're not only common here in Florida, they're common throughout North America, Central America, South America, and they're also found throughout the Caribbean. So they're definitely one of the most plentiful bat species. And in terms of friendly versus dangerous, no bats are really dangerous. They can carry diseases, so you do want to treat them with respect, but they're not going to be attacking you or trying to drink your blood or getting tangled in your hair. They kind of just want to be left alone, just like any other wild animal. Friendly is hard to say, but they're probably not going to make good pets, but you just want to give them the respect they deserve.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. How do researchers keep track of how many bats are living in the bat houses?
Man, that's a great question.
That is a good question. I think there's a couple of ways they can do estimates. So we're never going to have an exact number, but they can do what's called an emergence count, where they'll set up when the bats are emerging at sunset and try to pick a certain portion, maybe take photos and then count within photos in quadrants, or just try to estimate in terms of numbers as they're flying out, and then kind of multiply that out in terms of the length of the emergence and then the size of the bat houses. That's probably a a really kind of the best way to go about doing it. But it's always just going to be a broad estimate.
Okay, thank you.
Now that we've gotten a more clear understanding of what bats are and how they operate, we want to look into the data collection and the science research that actually goes into bats. Here on our campus, we have a museum, Florida Museum, called Dickerson Hall. We have here with us Dr. Verity Mathis, and she's going to explain to us a little bit of what goes into the Florida Museum and what happens in that museum. So, Dr. Mathis, can you take a brief moment and explain to us what actually is a collection and what happens within the Florida Museum?
Sure. So I work at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and that museum is made up of many different collections all across natural history. So we have collections of mammals, birds, paleontology, anthropology, archaeology. So I am in charge of the mammal collection, and so what that means is, if you think about a museum of natural history collection, it's kind of like a library where instead of books we have animals or bones, skins, we have tanned hides and skeletons, and each one of these animals is preserved in a way that it will last forever, in theory. And so we have, I think we have an example of a study skin. So in the mammal collection, we have preserved study skins like this. This is one of the bats from our Bahamas research. So it is preserved. It's made with cotton and wire, and it has the data tag associated with it, which I'll talk about more in a second. And we also have skeletons that we have cleaned, and we have tissues. We also sometimes get parasites or ectoparasites. And so within the museum, we have these collections, and these collections span, really over 100 years. And so we have data associated with these specimens that will tell us something about the populations that were found in a certain area, 50 to 60 to 70, 100 years ago. And then we can go to these caves or go to these different places and look to see if the same animals or the same species are found in those caves today. And then we can also kind of think about that in the future of what, in terms of human activities, habitat change, how that might affect those populations in the future. So the most important thing about a specimen really is this data tag that's associated with it. And with that data, we have sex, we have locality, we have weights, we have measurements. So we have a huge range of natural history information just located on one little specimen.
Okay, thank you. So in collecting the data for the Pacific bats and other mammals that are in the museum, are the animals alive when you get them, or are they dead when you get them? How does that exactly work?
Good question.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the research that we actually do today in our lab, we take the animal, we take a little piece of tissue, and Lauren will talk about this in a little bit, and then we let the animal go. But sometimes we need to bring an animal back into the museum to preserve it so we understand more about where it's found, especially if it's a new species, it's in a new place that doesn't have any other record. So usually the bats that we do get do come to our collection already dead. A lot of times we do get things like roadkill animals. We get a lot of animals that were given to a rehab that didn't quite make it. And then sometimes researchers have to humanely euthanize an animal for their research, and then they deposit it in our museum as well. So they come from all different kinds of ways, and they're each very important in their own way.
So can you explain some of the steps that actually go into the preservation of the animals that you have in the museum that you've collected?
Okay, great. So what I do for my job is I preserve a study skin like the one I just showed you, where we kind of stuff it with cotton. We clean the skeleton. We have a domestic beetle colony on our campus where we are able to put the skeletons through this domestic beetle colony, and the beetles do all the work for me. They eat all the tissue and the dried flesh on the skeleton and leave me with a beautiful clean skeleton. And then we have each one has given its label with all the data associated with it, and that's attached to the skin, and it's written on a label with the skeleton, and then we are able to put that information into our database and share that with the world.
So with the beetles handling so much of the work of cleaning the skeleton, is there any harmful effects that the beetles may be putting onto the skeleton or causing to the skeleton of the animals?
No. So the beetles, this is their job. They're found in the wild, and they're going to be eating, dried flesh and the dead animals that are that you might die out in the wild. So we just bring them into the lab and let them do what they would already be doing naturally. Only they work for us, But they don't want to eat bones, so they don't harm the skeletons, and they don't want to eat people. They don't want to eat, myself, my hands or anything like that. Okay. So, they just have one job, and as long as we provide them with food, they're happy to keep doing what they're doing, and they don't cause any harm.
Okay, so let's just say on a typical week, how many species of different animals, or how many animals have you acquired for that week as far as the museum?
That's really, it kind of varies. If we're not actively getting in a new collection or having somebody bringing in things to us, it can be a really quiet week where we're not getting anything new necessarily that week. A lot of times we have, once every few months, we'll get animals from the local rehabbers. Sometimes the animals just don't make it, especially if they come into the rehabbers already injured. So we'll get, some animals that way. But it just depends on the week and the year. There's no real rhyme or reason to it.
Okay. And how do you go about collecting and keeping up with all the data from the animals?
Right. So every animal that comes into the museum has data associated with it, hopefully. So that gets recorded into our catalog. It gets recorded on the labels and the skin tags that go with the skins. And then it goes into our database. So we have an electronic database that we can load all the data into. With that database, we can look at the coordinates, we can look at the locality using Google Earth, and then we can upload that data into a research portal that connects with all the other museums as well. So museums all across the country share their data with this research portal, and then anybody in the world can go and download that data if they're interested in a certain research project. And so in that way, it's digitized and it's freely available.
So just on average, what is the range of size of bats that you have in the collection as of now?
Oh, that's a good question. Mm-hmm. So we have one of the smallest bats we have in the collection. I actually have an example of it here. Mm-hmm. It's called a funnel-eared bat, and it is only about 2.5 to 3 grams. So it's, maybe weighs a couple of paper clips worth. And you can see how big it is compared to with my hand, and that's a full-size adult, so they're really small. So this is the smallest bat that we have in our collection. It's not the smallest bat in the world. That honor goes to the bumblebee bat, which is even smaller than this, but it is pretty small. And in terms of the largest bats, we have some representatives of the flying foxes, which are the large megabats that are found in Asia and Africa, and those can get. The largest species can get up to a 6-foot wingspan. We don't have a bat that big in our collection, but we do have some of the larger species that are, maybe 2 to 3 feet wingspan.
Okay. So just personally, what is your favorite part of during the collection process for bats?
I love seeing all the diversity. We have these cabinets that have all the specimens housed in them, and it's, you can open up a drawer and just see bats from all over the world. So it really helps me get an appreciation of just how many different species there are out there and all the different cool morphology, coat colors and patterns and sizes that there are. You really can't it's really hard to see all that in one spot, but in a natural history museum you can see all the diversity of a certain group in one drawer, and that's really fun.
Okay. Also, is it kind of hard keeping track of multiple bats at once as they are incoming?
Hopefully they'll all be kind of brought in a way that their data is associated with a certain bat, and and we have tags on them, or they're separated into bags, and so we know who is who and which data goes with which data. And sometimes it can get a little bit confusing if you're dealing with a lot of different bats, but it just takes a lot of organization and attention to detail, and we tend to not really make too many mistakes in mixing anything up. So yeah.
Okay, well, now we're going to go ahead and take some questions regarding this segment of data collections. We're going to step over here.
Thank you.
To start us off, we have a series of questions from Mabane Middle School. Alexander Weeks and Kayla Pyoff, and they're asking about the family life of bats, being how many kids can they have? Do both parents raise the young? How small are they when they're born? Can you tell us a little bit more about how the young are raised and their family units?
Sure, I'll have to. So every species is a little bit different, but by and large, what happens is the males and females mate, and then the males go off and do their own thing. And so in the caves where we study bats in the Bahamas, if we go into a cave in the right time of year when it's warm, late spring, early summer, it's going to be either males or females, and all the females will be together if they're pregnant and having kids. So it's not the kind of a typical family lifestyle you might expect. It's mostly the moms raising the young. They typically have one young at a time. Sometimes they'll have twins, but it's really hard on them because the animal has to be kind of big. So they typically have one. And when they're born, they don't fly. They're not as furry as they need to be to keep warm. So they stay close to their mom, and they will nurse for a month or two, and in that time they grow really rapidly. Their fur develops, they get enough muscle mass to fly, and then after that they're kind of on their own. So the moms do all the work, but the moms all stay together in great big colonies, and they kind of share the workload.
Okay, so we have another question from Mebane Middle School. Since a bat hangs upside down, wouldn't it die since its blood would rush to its head?
Great question. Actually, there's a lot of animals where they have to deal with a problem similar to that. You can think about a long-necked giraffe, right? So a giraffe has this super long neck and its head is way up on the top, and you've got to get a lot of blood to the brain, right? So the heart is really strong and it can push all the way uphill to get oxygenated blood to the brain. But imagine when that giraffe has to put its head down to drink. You would think that the same thing would happen. All the blood would rush to its head, it'd get a brain freeze or something, and it causes its head to explode. But that doesn't happen for giraffes, and it doesn't happen for bats either. So just because it's a little painful for us when all the blood rushes to our head when we're upside down, and we don't like it for too long, they have all kinds of physiological ways to keep the blood moving in the direction that it needs to, whether it's fighting gravity, heading upstream like we do, or letting it flow downstream slowly when they're upside down, where gravity is helping it move to their head.
We have another question from Mebane Middle School. The question is, in your opinion, what is the coolest thing a bat can do?
Yeah, what do you think?
So I think the coolest thing a bat can do is echolocate. So bats are one of the few groups of mammals that can send out sonar through their mouths and through their noses, and they emit all these clicks and squeaks, and that bounces off a tree, bounces off leaves, bounces off an insect, and it comes back to them, and then they can interpret that data. And if they're flying at night and it's dark, they can avoid tree limbs and avoid crashing into a tree or a branch. But then they can also detect a tiny little insect, the size of a mosquito, using this echolocation. So bats can do this, and whales, dolphins can also echolocate to it in a different manner. But sending out that sonar and having it come back to you and interpret it is something that we can't really do, but they can, and that's really unique.
Okay, another question from Kayla. Are there any diseases currently known in the UF bat houses?
Ooh, in the in the bat houses, well, all bats can carry rabies, so it is always a potential health risk to have, bats in the bat houses. But other known diseases other than that, I really can't think of any.
We have a follow-up question about bats hanging. Why? It's from Talbot by MJ. She wants to know, why do they hang upside down?
Yeah, so they've filled a really interesting niche, and so then they're living in caves. If you think about somewhere where you can live in a cave, if there's water, predators, or anything else, it's just a really unique adaptation they've developed to live in this environment, and they can hang from the ceilings much safer than they could live on the ground, and also when they're flying, it's much easier to take off and land if you're already in the air.
Right.
Okay, if you're still tuning in, we have here a doctoral student, Lauren Hammer, and she's going to discuss with us the research that goes behind the bats and the data collection that we just discussed with Dr. Mathis. Lauren, can you give us why you chose the Bahamas specifically and why you chose to study bats in the Bahamas?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think back to a little bit about what David Reed was talking about, we already had a great foot in the door knowing a lot about bats in the Caribbean in general from his work he'd done with his previous students, and specifically the Bahamas because of their really unique history. So if we think about geologically these islands, so today they're pretty small, they're pretty far apart, they're separated by deep water, but if we think back about 10,000 years ago and think about the last ice age, sea level was a lot lower because a lot of water was held in the ice caps. So when sea level was a lot lower, the Bahamas were much bigger, the islands were very large, and they were very close together. And then as time passed and the natural glacial cycles of the Earth moved on and the ice caps started to melt and sea level rose, the islands got much smaller and much further apart. And so we have this really interesting system where you have these really dramatic environmental changes happening, and we wanted to see how those environmental changes would impact different species. And so we thought bats would be a really interesting species to study here.
Okay, so you gave us the importance of why you wanted to study in this particular location, and that you believe that you can use the benefit of this location. Does the change in sea level have anything to do with the climate change that is occurring?
Yeah, so naturally the Earth goes through glacial and interglacial cycles where you'll have ice ages where the Earth gets cooler, ice gets held up in the poles, and sea level will drop. And then naturally it will oscillate back or move back in this kind of cycle where it'll get warmer. Sea level will rise as your ice caps start to melt. What we're worried about now is that humans on Earth are increasing greenhouse gases, and because of this, the Earth's getting a lot warmer than it would naturally during this interglacial cycle. And so we're going to see effects that you would expect on an unnatural level, I guess.
Okay, so when you're in the caves, and you're actually going to collect data, how does that exactly happen? Can you explain that process of actually being in the caves in the Bahamas?
Yeah, so it's a ton of fun. Okay. It's a really beautiful place to work, so we have a great time there. But when we go, we usually have a map of the island and a map of either where we know some caves are, or if we don't know where caves are, where they might be, just given the geology of the islands. And so then we have our maps and we have all of our field gear, and we have a long trek through the bush usually, so a nice adventure off into the wilderness, and then we find our cave. We go in during the day when the bats are all sleeping, so they're all in there hanging from the ceiling, and we go in, put down our gear. We have just nets, hand nets, think about like a big butterfly net, and we catch them while they're sleeping, take them, wear gloves when we're handling them, and we just get some measurements, measure their wings, take a scale so we can see how much they weigh, and we get little tiny tissue punches from their wings so that we can do our genetic work back here in Gainesville. And then we let them go and they go back to sleep, hopefully only mildly disrupted by us, and their little wing punch wound will heal in just a few weeks. And then when we have all of our DNA collected from our tissue samples, we package them up and send them back to Gainesville, and that's the end of our field day.
Okay, so are you actually able to travel with the data that you've collected, or the bats that you've collected from the study?
So unfortunately, no. Well, not unfortunately, because everybody wants to be safe. So because we're working with mammals specifically and not something like an amphibian, it is a mammal, so there are diseases that can be transmitted to humans. And so the Center for Disease Control in the U.S. likes us to ship things not on a commercial airline, which is understandable. So when we package everything up at the end of a field season or a field trip down in the Bahamas, we go to a local FedEx, we package everything, put all of our permits in it, and send it on its merry way back to Gainesville, and then we'll come on our flights and we'll meet back up here at some point after a few days of shipping, and that's when we get to start our lab work.
Okay. So in terms of analysis, can you explain briefly like the definition of just gene sequencing and genetics that goes into your analysis?
Yeah, so it's really interesting and cool technology and really interesting lab work. We get to get the little tissue punches we've pulled from the Bahamas, and then we break down the tissues in the lab, and then we can extract just raw DNA samples, which is just the basic building block of life, which is really interesting. And then through some programs that are pretty complicated but really, really neat, we can then take that DNA sequence and essentially read it. So we have a machine that can go through and just line by line tell us your A, C, T's, and G's of a DNA sequence. And then you can compare them between individuals and you can figure out how similar or different populations are to each other.
So at one point in time, how many comparisons between species can you do?
So I am personally working with 3 species in the Bahamas, and we work on, right now, around 10 islands. So we're doing 3 species across 10 different islands and seeing how they're going to vary between those locations.
Okay, so futuristically speaking, where do you project your research to go, and what do you plan to obtain?
Yeah, so what we're really hoping to do, since the Bahamas have gone through these really dramatic changes, being really big and close together and now being very small and far apart, we want to see how species respond to climate change. And looking at past climate change can help us predict what would happen in the future for future climate change. And if we can figure out how they responded last ice age to now, we can maybe help conservationists in the future say, we think this will happen to these species if climate change progresses the way it's going. And hopefully that can help save some species one day.
Okay, so as of like right now, can you pinpoint any type of key features that stand out about bats as their evolution has changed with the sea levels changing and climate change? Can you point out any key factors that have changed historically in bats?
So bats as a whole, I'm not sure I could say, but in the Bahamas specifically, we've seen, looking at the fossil record to now, some really interesting changes where even just 500 years ago, we had upwards of 13 species of bats living in the Bahamas. Today, we only have about 6 common species, so we've had lots of extinctions there, mediated either by climate change and the effects that it has, or by human colonization. And if we can really pinpoint the drivers of that, that could really help conservation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So we're going to go ahead and take questions for segment 3 from our scientist.
We have a question by Hannah Price. The question is, are bats being affected by climate change?
Sure. So, yes, I think most animals probably are. In our study system in the Bahamas, where we can really see it is the changes in island size and island environment over time as the climate changes, the habitats change, as well as the cave environments change, and the amount of land available to them as sea levels change. And I think we'll see that a lot more as places get warmer or wetter or drier, depending on how things shift.
Okay, and another question. It has 2 parts. How long do bats live? And it's by MJ. And then by maybe in middle school, what is the biggest predator of bats?
Oh, that's a great question. So bats are really interesting in the fact that they can live a really long time. So most small mammals, like a mouse, only lives maybe 2 years in the wild, where bats have been known to live 30, 35 years in the wild. They are a really long-lived mammal for their size. And if you think about the fact that they can only have 1 pup a year, maybe 2 pups if they're lucky, that means that they need to live a really long time to try to build up their populations and maximize their ability to have babies. But it also means that they're really susceptible to population crashes and damage to their caves. If you hurt a population of bats, it's going to take them a very long time to recover. But they do live a long time, which is a nice little bit of a trade-off. And in turn, what was the second part of the question? Predators. That's right, biggest predators. So the biggest predators for bats tend to be avian predators like hawks and owls, and also snakes. Snakes like to hang out in the caves, and they can snag bats as they fly out. And hawks and birds, like here at our bat houses, we have a couple of hawks that always hang out every night at the bat houses, waiting to kind of take an unsuspecting bat. So those are the biggest ones in the wild.
So speaking about how long bats live and their longevity, Kayla Payov has a question. Are there species of bats that have already gone extinct?
That's a good question.
Yeah, there are. So we study the bats in the islands of the Bahamas, and a lot of those caves, there are great fossils of bats that used to be there. So we see fossils from about 3,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and we can find fossils of the bat species that are still there today, populations that have not gone extinct. But we also see fossils of bats that used to live there and have gone extinct. So sometimes they're just gone from the Bahamas, and those bat species occur in other places, like in Cuba, for instance. But in other cases, they're extinct completely, and it's a species that's just gone to science. So that's one of the things that Lauren is going to be studying in her dissertation, and that is, what are some of the causes of bats going extinct in the Bahamas?
Okay, and another question from Hannah. What is the diet of a bat?
Oh, the diet of a bat? So do you want to do this one? Oh, well, there's lots of different things that bats can eat. So many of them around here eat insects, and they eat lots of different kinds of insects. So little tiny bats will eat really small insects. Bigger bats can eat big things like big moths. But you also have fruit bats that eat lots of different kinds of fruit. You have some bats that are pollinators with these long noses, and they have long tongues that they can stick down in flowers, and they pollinate those flowers and they suck up the nectar. So quite a few different things. And then, of course, there's vampire bats, which eat blood. There's only 3 species of those.
We have a question by Hannah. What are a few things people at home can do to help stop climate change?
Great question.
Sure. So the name of the game for climate change right now is really just trying to limit our carbon footprint in general. So things like driving less, using less electricity at your house, using less water, trying to just be as conservative as possible as an individual is really the best thing you can do.
Okay, and another question from maybe in middle school. How can you tell the gender of a bat?
Yeah, so you can tell externally, just like with most mammals, when we catch a bat, you can tell just morphologically, externally, male or female.
We have another question from Mabane Middle School. Do bats pass down any genes? So what characteristics do they pass on?
Yeah, so all genetics are going to be passed on parent to child for any sort of species. That's, your basic biology. So I, as a child, half of my genes approximately came from my mother and half came from my father, and it's going to be the same thing for a bat.
Okay, another question from Kayla. Does the size of the flying fox impact its life expectancy in comparison to other bat species?
That's a good question. Do you know how long?
I don't know, but generally speaking, that's exactly right. So typically speaking, bigger animals are much longer lived than smaller animals. And so a big flying fox, which is really, really large, should have a much longer lifespan. They should have, their genes should evolve slower, their body mass should be bigger, all of those things correlate over all mammals, and certainly within a group of mammals like bats. So I don't know the exact answer, but generally speaking, that should be right.
So we have another question from Mabane Middle School. We know that we have the UF bat houses here in Florida, but which region of the world has the most bats? Where would you find them?
Sure. The amount of bat species in a given area varies dramatically all over the world. So, for instance, we only have 13 species of bats here in Florida, but if you were to go out west in the United States to California or New Mexico even, there are many more species out there. The same is true for tropical places. Tropical places have more niches, more places that an animal can live. And so if you go down to the Central America or the northern part of South America and the Andes, they all have more species there too. But I think the most bat species are actually found in Southeast Asia, another tropical place with really high bat diversity.
Okay, and one last question from maybe in middle school. What type of hybrid bats in the world?
Hybrid bats?
Yeah.
I don't know of any. So hybrids are an interesting thing. So mammals can hybridize pretty easily in certain cases, and so I'm sure that there are some hybrid bats, but I don't know of any specific cases. Do you guys? Yeah, so they stumped us. That student totally stumped us. When populations are similar and they are close in contact with one another, we see hybridizations occurring in lots of different mammal species, but I don't know the bats well enough to know for sure of one particular example. Good question.
Hi everyone, so we're wrapping up here in Gatortown. Thank you all for tuning in, for all the schools in Florida, all the schools in Louisiana, Alabama, Maine, Oklahoma. Shout out to Louisiana. Thank you all for tuning in. You can leave if you don't have time to stay with us. If you do have time, please feel free to tune in to our questions, ask us questions as many as you want. And thank you once again for tuning in for our EFT and Bats and Beyond.
We have another question from Kayla, and Kayla's asking, what is the size of an average bat colony? Does that vary based on species?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Bat colonies vary by species quite a lot. So I'll give you two quick examples. In the caves in the Bahamas where we do our research, there's this one species, Macrotus. It's a really big bat. It has huge ears, and we never find more than 4 or 5 of those bats in any one cave. They're really solitary for some reason. But that littlest one, the funnel-eared bat that Verity showed you, I think, or at least talked about, it occurs like in numbers like 10,000. I mean, a whole wall of the cave will be dotted with those little guys. So for some reason, and we don't know yet why, they occur in huge numbers in a cave, and other species are much more solitary and might be only 5 or 10 individuals.
Okay, will it ever get to a point where when a bat eats another bat?
Bats eating other bats. Do you know of an example?
I don't know of a specific example, but I have read it in the literature of some of the larger bats eating some of the smaller bats, just like they might eat a rodent. Some of the bats can be quite carnivorous. There are bats that eat fish. There are bats that eat frogs. There is the occasional report of a bat eating another bat.
We have another question by Alexandra. The question is, are there any new developments in the white nose fungus syndrome? We have very few bats left here in northern Maine.
Oh, that's so sad, but that's a great question. The latest development that I've heard of in the past few months is they are actually, they found this bacterium that they can use on the bats and kind of paint this bacterium on the bats and in the caves, and it seems to have been really good at slowing and killing the fungus. So that's been a very positive outlook or occurrence that they are trying to use to fight white nose syndrome. But in terms of any other new developments, have you heard of anything?
Nothing other than that.
The bats do seem to be slowly kind of recovering and stabilizing from what I've read. So we've had some really hard population crashes, especially up in the northeast, like in Maine, but they seem to kind of be leveling out a little bit. So they're hoping that the bats that have survived white nose are a little bit more resistant to the fungus. They'll pass on those genes, and then the next generation of bats will be more resistant as well, and so maybe from now on we'll have a slow recovery.
Okay, so Hannah has 2 questions. Do bats live and travel in colonies or packs? And do bat colonies have alphas just like wolf packs?
They have what?
I didn't hear.
Oh, alphas? Oh, interesting. So they live in colonies, but they don't really travel so much in colonies. So when we go into a cave, we'll see a big colony or roost of bats, and it can be really dense, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of individuals. And that's great for protection from predators, for staying warm in a cold cave, and all kinds of other things. But once they emerge from the cave, they typically travel out to feed and do other things in a more solitary manner. And so I'm not aware of any social structure in bats at all. I've never heard any reports of that. Have you guys? So none of that social behavior that does occur in so many other kinds of mammals and other insects as well. I mean, in insects as well, but not in bats to my knowledge.
So we have another question from Mabane Middle School. Do you have any thoughts on Batman? Yes, thoughts, opinions,
Is that
Batman.
mine? That is mine. I think if there was a real Batman that had all the capabilities of an actual bat, it would be cooler than the Batman we really have.
Right.
Yeah, that's my thought.
Okay, I think it might have been answered already, but just to reiterate the question, how many bats are there in the world?
So So there are approximately about 1,400 species of bats in the world. The number can vary depending on who you talk to, but that's the last estimate that I heard. And so like we only have 13 species here in Florida, and so that is a really small, really tiny percentage of the worldwide diversity. But bats do make up a quarter of all mammalian diversity. So if you think there's about 5,000 species of mammals in the world, and bats are a quarter of that.
And one more question from Mabane Middle School. Why did you choose to be a scientist out of all the other jobs out there?
That is a great question. I don't know. I don't know that I ever consciously chose to be a scientist. I've always loved animals. I've always loved mammals, especially. I always thought I would maybe be like a veterinarian or animal keeper at the zoo or something like that. And then I just kind of fell into science and into the museum world, and it just kind of happened. I've always loved science, and that was just the path that seemed most natural. But I think we can all answer this.
Sure. I had a professor in college, and his job was to go out on his boat with his ATV and drive up and down beaches looking for sea turtle nests. And he did this all summer long, and I thought, oh my gosh, what a great job. And so to see him have that much fun at work, just a light bulb went off for me, and it's like, that's the job I have to have. Not only do I want to be a scientist, but I want to be a professor at a university so that you have the flexibility of doing all of those fun projects.
Yeah, my answer will be pretty similar, but I always knew I wanted to work outside. I wanted to be outdoors and work with animals. And when I went to college, I just had this total new world open to me when I was in the biology department, because I got to see the amazing things that the students and the professors got to do and get paid for it, which is just mind-blowing. So we've had such a great time doing our field work, and most scientists do. So that's one of the really wonderful things about it.
Okay, and one last question. How does the white-nosed fungus injure the bats? By Kayla.
Yeah, so the white-nosed fungus is really insidious. It's not the fungus that actually harms the bat. What happens is the bats essentially catch a cold in the middle of winter when they're hibernating in their cave. That fungus is a real irritant to them, and the problem is they wake up from their hibernation, and when they wake up from their hibernation, they have to expend a lot of energy. They need to feed, there's no insects to eat, and so by waking up and their metabolism going back up to where it normally would be, they essentially starve to death, and it's really, really sad. So the fungus is disrupting their natural hibernation, and that's the thing that's really costly to these bats in white-nose syndrome.
Thank you so much for tuning in with us and for participating in this electronic field trip. We hope that you enjoyed it. And for anyone else